So recently, I heard a snippet of the very popular Dave Ramsey show. And in the show, and now I need to probably preface all of this by saying this. I am not an economist. I do not teach personal finance. I cannot tell you whether Dave gives good financial advice. But I can tell you Dave gives terrible theological advice. And you have to be really careful because his theology informs the way he talks about finances. Someone wrote in during this snippet that I saw asking him an ethical question. They asked Dave, is it greedy for people to own 15 to 20 houses in a world where there are so many people without homes, and in a world where middle-class people can't even afford homes? Is it greedy to own 15 to 20 houses? And I thought to myself, 15 to 20 houses, that's an easy answer. But something about the question clearly triggered Dave. By the end of the clip, he was villainizing the guy who asked the question, calling him a communist, accusing him of being bad with his own money. He even called the guy a Gnostic. And for those of you who haven't been to seminary, Gnostics are a 2nd century heresy group that have nothing to do with personal finances. So clearly Dave was triggered. I was genuinely surprised they even let the clip air. But villainizing the guy wasn't even the worst part of it. How Dave justified his own ownership of 15 to 20 houses is what I thought was really interesting. I wonder if you will find it as absurd as I did. Dave said, well, I own 15 to 20 houses, but I don't own anything because I'm a Christian. God owns it, and I'm just managing it for him. Look, you can agree or disagree with Dave on the ethics of owning 15 to 20 houses. But once he brought God into the equation, to minimize his own role and his own ethical responsibility in what he owns, to justify himself, you just know as soon as he brought God into the equation, he's just Jesus juking himself and everyone who's listening to him. He's using God to justify his own lack of self-reflection, his unwillingness to self-reflect. But I think, if I can take this one step further, I think he's doing something even worse than that. I'm trained in rhetoric, and so my job is to pay attention not only to words, but the effect of words on audiences. And the effects of words like that are not just that he is justifying his own greed. The effects of these words are that he is actually, because it's on a podcast with millions of listeners, he's actually creating a community, a Christian community, that is utterly desensitized to greed. This is his real goal, not just to justify himself, but for you to be numb to greed. He goes on, he says, amounts don't create greed. Greed is a spirit, not an amount. Again, maybe it's just the rhetorician in me. This is terribly misleading language. By defining greed as some amorphous, ill-defined, undefined spirit, especially in a world where people have so little, he is freeing you to live by your own conscience without self-reflection. Whatever my spirit says is greedy, and if my spirit doesn't say it's greedy, it must not be greedy. And Dave's spirit clearly doesn't think 15 to 20 houses is greedy, so he of all people must not be greedy. After all, God owns it all. And if you're a good Christian, God owns all you have too, so don't worry about it, just manage it. But he's not taking into account the fact that we don't live in a neutral world where you and I have consciences that are just default good. This is where I am probably not a good, can I just say this? In many ways, my theology has been shaped for the good away from conservative Protestantism into a mainline Protestant Methodist tradition. But there is still a part of mainline Protestant liberalism that I think fails often, and it is that we do not take into account the nature of human sin. That we are not neutral observers of the world. We're not even, first and foremost, like fundamentally good observers of the world. That we are genuinely a mixed bag of good and sin, of righteousness and sin, and that we have to be self-reflective about the ways that our culture numbs us to sin, numbs us to things like greed. And if we're not aware of those things, our consciences are not liberated to think about them clearly. And I think Dave assumes that we're all just neutral observers of our own economic world, and we're not. We have been deeply, deeply shaped by the anxiety of fear, anxiety of indebtedness, the anxiety of consumerism, the anxiety of keeping up, the anxiety of what happens if I don't have enough. Right? All of these things deeply, deeply shape our conscience. So you can't just come to a question about greed and assume ourselves to be neutral. Especially in a world where some people have so much and some people have so little. So he wants to create a community that is drawing God into their self-deception, even though the Bible tells us, I think, two pretty clear things about greed. One, that the greedy will never be satisfied. This is a thing Scripture talks about over and over and over. The greedy will never be satisfied. It blows my mind when I hear people talk about politicians or the famous quadrillionaire guy who's been slashing all the aid to poor folks in this country. Be like, well, he's a billionaire. Like, what? He doesn't really want anything else. He's just here for the good of the country. Like, he doesn't want more. No, he wants more. The greedy will never be satisfied. If we believe Scripture, the greedy will never be satisfied. Because the more you acquire, the more power you have. And you can't ever, if you live in a world of anxiety, you can't ever feel like you have enough power until you control everything. The second thing the Bible tells us is the greedy will never recognize the fact that they are in fact greedy. Because they're never satisfied, they will never think that they have enough. We will never think we have enough. In a world of human sin, in a world where creation doesn't, as we learned about in Genesis 3, where creation doesn't produce at the root, at the level we think it should to make us feel like secure, we will never have enough. Because the root issue is not about money. The root issue is whether this baby has loved this sermon. Just a regular reminder to anybody, but if your babies talk back to me, it's great. I'll talk louder, okay? We're never going to have enough to feel secure. We're always going to say, if I just had a little bit more. But these two facts, because of these two facts, God instituted certain laws called the Jubilee laws to make sure that the insatiable greed of some did not result in the perpetual poverty of others. The Jubilee laws were there to make sure that the insatiable greed of some did not result in the perpetual poverty of others. Basically, these laws were as follows. Number one, Jubilee was a Sabbath of Sabbaths. Every seventh week was a Sabbath week. Every seventh year was a Sabbath year, and Jubilee happened after the seventh Sabbath year, which is, as Vicky read, the 49th year. On the 50th year was supposed to be consecrated as a Jubilee year, a Sabbath year of Sabbath years. Now, given that the life expectancy of people in this age was around 40 to 50 years old, the expectation was that the Jubilee laws would be practiced about once in everyone's lifetime. That meant, then, that what would happen is on the Jubilee year, on the Day of Atonement, the Jubilee year, a shofar would blow, indicating the start of the year. And that the land from then on was to lay fallow. Now remember, back in the Sabbath commands and the Ten Commandments, even the land gets to rest. The animals get to rest. So the land is supposed to lay fallow and unfarmed for the entire year. The land doesn't work, neither do the farmers work for a full year. 3, there would then be a redemption of debt. I say forgiveness up on the screen. Forgiveness is a little bit more complicated. The more I studied Jubilee, the more it's not quite forgiveness, but it's also definitely not. What they're trying to do is make sure that people do not live in generational perpetual poverty year after year, generation after generation. So they provided a means for people to have that debt alleviated on the 50th year every year, so that debt was not passed on to the next generation. Number 4, people enslaved in Israel were set free. Now, this was also a financial, economic freedom, because Israel, for the most part, especially when you're talking about Hebrews who were enslaving other Hebrews. See, you have to get American slavery out of your mind. This was not race-based slavery. It was if I found that my land didn't produce harvest and I was going to lose everything and my family was going to starve, I could essentially sell my family as laborers to Matt. And Matt would sort of own us for a set period of years to make sure that that debt could get paid off. At the Jubilee year, no matter what, me and my family were set free. And we went out without debt. Which meant also that if I had to sell my land to Matt, it was never a permanent sale. The Jubilee year essentially said that if Matt also had the deed to my land, the deed was, I don't know what this would be called in modern day economics. It's not rent, but he essentially, quote, owns it for a period of time, recognizing that the ultimate owner is me. He's just managing it for God, okay? Which is a little bit telling. Because when you manage it for God, you give it back. It's not yours. So at the Jubilee year, I leave without debt and I leave with my land back. So the land is redistributed, guaranteeing that my family would not be pushed into generational poverty. Now, all of these items, I was originally going to cover in the next few weeks, and then I realized as I started studying that it was way too darn complicated, and it would be much better suited for like a Sunday school setting. Okay, so we're going to end our Jubilee, we're going to end our Sabbath discussions this week, and for the rest of the year, I'm going to go to the lectionary. That said, Jubilee was a Sabbath of Sabbaths, and we need to understand that in order to understand the rest of these laws. To say that Jubilee was a Sabbath of Sabbaths is not just a numerical claim. It's not just saying something about the 49th and the 50th year. It is to say that no one, it is to say that if we're going to be the kind of people who radically set those oppressed free, who make sure that debt is dealt with as an equitable and just way, if we're the kind of people who are going to return land back to original owners so that people aren't in perpetual poverty, if we're going to think that way as a people, we have to understand that Jubilee was a Sabbath of Sabbaths. Because the weekly Sabbaths instilled in us small practices of economic patience, of self-reflection, and of justice that prepare us to do the bigger things of once every 7 years, taking a year of resting, of being patient, of thinking of economic justice. And if we do that once every 7 years, then our imaginations are formed so that once every 50 years, we can do the big redistribution of things and the big elimination of poverty from our midst. In other words, I want to say that God understands that we will never be able to imagine a wholesale erasure of poverty and indebtedness and homelessness if we cannot also imagine and enact and practice smaller actions that reorient our conscience and get us to reflect on justice and goodness and beauty and poverty and wealth and greed. So it's not surprising to me that I would encounter Dave Ramsey or anybody else. It's not just Dave. It's us. It's not surprising to me that I would encounter someone who's like 15 to 20 houses. What's the big deal? God manages it. In a world that is constantly forming us to want more. What would make the church different as a community if we were in fact the kind of people who learn contentment? If we were in fact the kind of people who were reflective about our consumer practices? If we were in fact the kind of people who were willing to do with less so that other people could simply survive? Our obedience to God on the seventh day and then in the seventh year teaches us how to trust God in radical ways in the years of Jubilee, calling for blanket debt reimagining and setting prisoners free and liberating slaves and restoring ancestral land. I have a friend who is really into Native American justice. And I asked him one time, I was like, man, like, what do you want us to do? Like, I didn't take this land from anybody. My ancestors did. I can own that. That's not a piece of American history that we have to deny. I can own, in fact, that the taking of that land has generational consequences for Native American people. I can own that. I can own that we have systemic poverty in communities of color because of the actions of people who look like me historically. But what am I supposed to do about it? Like if I restore the land to all of the original indigenous peoples who live here, what am I supposed to do? Do I just go back to Germany where I've never lived and I don't speak the language? Like, what am I supposed to do? So what am I saying? I'm saying in that question that I cannot imagine alternatives to the way things are now. And my friend said, "You lack the imagination because you think everybody thinks of ownership the way you do. You assume that ownership is private. That is what you privately own and what you have the deed to." He said, indigenous people have never had that assumption about ownership. They're always willing to share the land. They just don't want you to privately own it so that they don't have access to resources and they're in perpetual poverty. So do you see what I'm saying? Now, I'm undoubtedly way more complicated than this, okay? But the point is, I had certain assumptions about ownership, about land, about how things work because I am so thoroughly shaped by an American context. So when we start having conversations in this country about reparations for African Americans, right? You will see that almost exclusively 99.9% of white people will immediately just experience despair and be like, well, I don't know what we're supposed to do about that. It's been 100 years. No, it hasn't. So we have entire generations of white people who feel despair and shame about what our ancestors did. But instead of trying to think outside the box by thinking about what it would look like to restore economic equity, we just either deny that it happened, deny that it was a problem, deny that it's still a problem, and then throw up our hands and be like, the problem's too big to solve. Yeah, well, it's convenient for us to say that the problem's too big to solve because our children are not hungry. And then what do? We know sociologically, we know that imprisonment and crime are largely tied to economics before one is incarcerated. We know it. So we know that bettering people's economic situations will actually bring crime rates down. But what do? Let's be tough. We're going to be the law and order people. Let's send in the National Guard to solve the problem. It's not a problem that needs to be solved. America has like 5% of the world's population and 25% of its prisoner population. And that is entirely related to economics. And the church, of all people, should be on the forefront imagining an alternative world that begins not just with rethinking incarceration, but with rethinking economics for goodness and justice and beauty and the dignity of humans everywhere. I don't even know where I am in my notes. I'm so gone. Our inability to imagine a world without crippling generational debt is directly tied to our unwillingness to practice Sabbath with any kind of thoughtful consistency. Look, I don't know if student loan forgiveness is good policy or not. I don't know if student loan forgiveness is good policy, but I do know that generations of people drowning in insurmountable poverty is not a good solution. And I do know that the reason we can't imagine an alternative is because capitalism has shaped us in such a way that greed is considered good, where education costs so much. It's not wealthy people's children who are coming out on the other end of college with massive amounts of debt. It's middle class and poor people's children. It doesn't have to be that way. We just refuse to acknowledge an alternative. I don't know if it's good international policy to forgive or renegotiate the debt of the one-third world. Do you understand that the one-third world, how much they owe the European and Western countries? While we take their resources, they still go into insurmountable debt, and then we wonder why they elect dictators. And we wonder why terrorists show up every few years. It's connected. They don't hate us for our freedoms. They hate us because we economically exploit them, put them in the debt, and take their resources. We cannot imagine radical debt forgiveness because our imaginations are held captive by a certain system of capitalism that benefits some and not others. But the truth is that we're not alone. Because biblical scholars actually tell us that ancient Israel never practiced Jubilee as far as the biblical record or the archaeological record goes. There's no evidence that Israel ever actually practiced the Jubilee year. We have reason to think that Dave Ramsey, like you and me, ancient Israel found ways of deflecting from their greed. Greed isn't about forgiving debt or about leveling the economic playing field. You communists. Greed is a spirit. Or less obnoxiously, they probably just thought it was completely impractical to do something so radical. The fact is that we always have reasons and we always have excuses for not doing what we know is the right thing to do. And while Israel may have never practiced it, it is my job. You pay me to do this. You pay me to do this. You pay me to tell you that greed is more than just a spirit. It may not be a certain amount, but it's not just a spirit. I can deceive myself by saying, everything belongs to God. I'm just managing it. If you really believe that, then you would practice Sabbath and you would practice Jubilee. After all, was it not Jesus who in his very first sermon in his own hometown congregation stood up behind the desk to preach, unrolled to the Jubilee passage in Isaiah, read about debt forgiveness, read about setting prisoners free, read about all of those things, and then said, today we start doing this. Today this is fulfilled in your own ears. And do you remember what their response was? From those of you who were with us in the Gospel of Luke for a year and a half, they tried to kill him. Because they couldn't imagine a world that was radically reoriented and reimagined that way. A world where land was redistributed and people weren't enslaved to debt. And Jesus didn't just preach it, he lived it. He owned nothing. He treated strangers like they were family. He gave away his life because he truly believed that everything, including his very breath, belonged to God. And so here's the question that I want to end with. Will we keep finding clever ways to baptize our greed in religious language like I don't own anything, God owns it, while we clutch our 20 houses? Or will we begin living as if everything we have, our time, our money, our possessions, even our very lives, belongs to God? Weekly Sabbath retrains our hearts for that kind of freedom. And Jesus is inviting us to live it radically, joyfully, even dangerously, until the poor hear the good news and the captives are set free and the greedy no longer determine what everybody else's life has to be like. That is the good news of the gospel of the God who doesn't hold our debts against us.